Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. We are the Young Ummah, and today my discussion is going to be on bridging generation and culture gaps. Now, let me ask you guys a question. What do you think, first off, what do you think is the definition of a culture or a generation gap? Yeah.
The difference in two cultures that prevents mutual understanding.
Okay, prevents mutual understanding. That's a good answer. But that answer is not actually what I'm going to be focusing on. What I'm going to be focusing on is what actually makes that gap. What actually makes your answer. Now, there are a lot of differences between across generations. Some are easy to see, and some are very difficult to see. Now, the differences across generations that are very easy to see are things like language, fine arts, things like popular interests and culture, things like even the things like what we eat. These things are very easy to see. However, there are also differences across generations that are very difficult to see, such as changing concepts of justice, gender roles, things like manners and conducts. These things are very difficult to see. So what actually makes these differences? What is the reason for these differences? One reason has to do with economic standpoint. Now, typically, we think of the parent who has, a low economic status, who basically has nothing in an underdeveloped country and goes to the United States and, goes to make a better life for him and his family. And then we see that with the child is brought up here, in a very developed country, and has the benefits that the parent kind of gives to the child, economically. There are also societal differences between the parent and the child. For instance, we see that the child has places different important points or different significant areas in things like gender roles. These societal differences are actually very prevalent when it comes to differences between the parent and the child. And there are also technological advances that cause these differences in generations. So we typically think that the child is more adapted to things like portable devices and laptops, and we kind of think as a parent, we think of the parent as someone who is a little bit more inept. So we see that there's a multitude of differences across these generations. We also see that there are differences in Islamic and moral values across generations, and this is something that's very important. Even though the text is the same, even though we think of the text as supposed to be constant, the moral and Islamic values still tend to change across generations. For instance, the child may think of different moral and Islamic values as more important than what the parent might think, and vice versa. Okay, so I basically explained to you what makes the gap and what the gap actually is. So I'm going to ask you another question. What actions can you take to bridge this gap? Anyone?
I think maybe like open communication between the child and the parent to see like what's happening in the child's life.
Okay, open communication. Anyone else?
Consideration on the child's part to understand the values and what's important to the parent.
Okay. All right. Good answers.
Okay, so both of those are really good answers. Now, there's a lot of different factors that we can talk about, but it would take us all night. So for time's sake, we're going to focus on two main perspectives. So basically, any problem has two sides. You can't clap without two hands, right? So first, I'm going to start off bashing the youth a little bit, and then I'm going to bash the parents. So starting off with the youth, what can the youth do? So in your guys' answers, you said communication, and that's the first thing I'm going to talk about, is communicate. Now, I'm guilty of this, Brother Valid is guilty of this, a lot of us youth are guilty of this, that we just don't communicate. And yes, that kind of has to do with the technological advances, but we can't put all the blame on that. If we do look at our technology, how often do we set our phone aside? Often we look like we're walking zombies wherever we go. We're constantly staring at our screen. How often do we sit down with our parents and talk to them without constantly checking our phone? Again, I'm guilty of this. My mom would say I'm guilty of this. we don't have actual conversations. We're so used to like communicating through a screen. And not only do we do it with our family members, we do it with everyone. So how can we solve this? First of all, we grew up with a lot of technology that our parents didn't have. And, some of our parents, they don't know how to use this technology. So if they don't know how to text, teach them how to text. If they have smartphones, teach them the difference between Twitter and Facebook and Snapchat. Integrate that into their lives so that you can communicate with them effectively. But besides the technology, even setting that aside, don't let it consume you. And this, of course, I'm talking to myself first. Like, we all need to learn to actually sit down and just talk without any technology. So that's the first factor. The second thing that we need to work on is that we need to stop being narrow-minded. So, again, like Brother Valid mentioned, like most of our parents, they came from different cultures. They immigrated over here. And, we like to think we were born and raised here and, we're American, we're the best. We like to, like, believe that all the time, but we don't take the time to remember our roots. We don't take the time to remember where we came from. Yes, we're American, but our parents had certain struggles that they went through to get here. And a lot of the countries that they came from, they didn't even have like the basic necessities that we take for granted. Even like our education, us being college students, having a college education, that's like a really big ni'mat. Like that's not something everyone has. If we look at these underdeveloped countries, little kids are selling chai and newspapers on the street, and then they go to school at night. Like, we don't have to do that. We have access to free high school grade education, and then alhamdulillah most of us have access to college education. So we take these things for granted and we don't realize what we have to us, and how can we like not take these things for granted? So one thing we would like to say as youth is working really helps, and both of us can vouch for this, and many of the college students and high school students, I bet, in the audience who work would say the same thing. When you work as a college student, most of the time you start off at minimum wage. You realize the amount of money you're making in an hour is going to translate to like a Subway sandwich and a drink from Dunkin' Donuts. You realize the value of every cent that you worked for that hour. And that really makes you appreciate what our parents go through on a day-to-day basis, how hard they work for us. Not just the struggle they took to get here, but in general, every hour that they put in every day to make sure that we have a sound shelter and home. So, like I promised, I bashed the youth, and now I'm going to bash the parents a little bit. So what can the parents do to bridge this gap? So I just talked about how as youth often we don't recognize our roots, we don't acknowledge our parents' culture. Now on the parent spectrum, often the focus goes a little bit too much on the culture, and building the foundation and the deen isn't taken into account as much. So we kind of have two extremes going on here, and we need to kind of come together and have a moderation, have a balance between the two. So in terms of the parents, yes, culture is important and our roots are important, but our deen tells us that at the end of the day, it's, our belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that brings us together. Like with this hadith on the screen, it says, a white has no superiority over black, nor a black has any superiority over white except by piety and good action. Now, most of you have probably heard this. But, our deen tells us, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, yes, He made us into different nations and tribes, but it's not so that we stay secluded in our bubbles. Now, growing up here, I grew up here in Albany, and mashallah, we have a huge Muslim community, but just, going to a lot of the gatherings that we go to, I can say, like, how often did I see people of different color? Not very often. Most of the time, it was the same color as my color. That's kind of a problem, right? Like, if we're staying in our own bubbles, how are we bridging the gap? We're increasing the gap. What are we teaching our children? What are we teaching the upcoming generations? That we want to stay secluded that way? It's not a good message. That's not what Islam teaches us.
Now another thing that the parents should really do is, and that I can't really stress this enough, is to spend time with your child. Typically, generally, this is a general thing, is that typically in a Muslim family, every weekend a parent will take their child to Islamic school or weekend school. They'll drop them off. They'll go away for a couple hours, come back, and pick them up, and that would be the Islamic education of a typical Muslim here in the United States. We have to, we really have to counteract. I mean, and the parent has to be a lot more proactive in spending time with your child, especially in terms of their Islamic education. You really gotta, I think parents really need to understand what the child is going through when they're learning about the Quran, or, history of Islam, or any sort of Islamic studies. And, it'll really give the parent, a greater perspective on what the child goes through when the child is, studying these things. Another thing that I'd like to stress is, discipline, and being strict, and setting rules and laws for your child is a good thing. It gives your child a sense of discipline, but you also need to have a sense of support and care for your child. You need to be a friend for your child. Your child needs to come to you and talk to you about things like private matters. He or she, the child, needs to be comfortable with talking to you about things that he or she wouldn't talk to with regular people. The parent really needs to have that support mechanism in hand for their child. And another thing that really I can't stress enough is you have to build that strong relationship with your child from the get-go. You really need to get that support and care, not starting when the child is a teenager, but starting like before the child is even like able to walk. You really need to start from the get-go. Your child who's a teenager and who you neglected for such a long time is not going to listen to you if you try to discipline him or her at that point in time. You need to start from the get-go, and you need to spend time with your child like when in the early days, and so that'll give them a sense of who you are as a parent, and they'll be more comfortable in talking about like matters like private matters and things like that. So the take-home message that I would like to point out is that it's not the parents' fault. It's not just the parents' fault, but it's also not just the child's fault. I think it's both. It's both the fault of the parents and the children that creates this generational gap, and we really need to make an effort to close this gap. Sure, yes, we have a multitude of differences such as language, popular interests, things like that. Yes, but we can still close this gap by having a sense of perspective. By really understanding what the other is going through. The children need to understand that, what parents had to go through, the hardships that the parents had to endure, when they came to this country. They need to understand the hardships that the parent has gone through, and the parents need to do the same thing. They need to understand, a growing child's perspective, and really just perspective is really all you need in order to close this gap. So on that note, are there any questions that you guys have? No? Thank you very much. Jazakallah khair.